This wasn't just another dawn. It was Veterans Day. A man walked by. Quiet. Aged. Unseen. They caught the hat, the shuffle, the weathered skin, and believed they understood. But they had no clue. They didn't hear the missions sealed in silence. They didn't know the lives saved in places too distant to name. They couldn't read the letters written to men long gone, still honored with every breath. This wasn't about routine. This was reverence, wrapped in silence, walking on 2 feet. Not because he asked for attention, because true dignity speaks without asking. Before we go further, drop where you're watching from, and if you believe that respect never expires, like, subscribe, because this story, this matters. The gate at Fort Grantham sat beneath the rising sun, washed in soft amber. Shadows stretched over the blacktop. The booth by the checkpoint buzzed with idle talk and smirking looks. Elijah Monroe approached, 82 years old, his spine upright, his hands steady, his pace even. A brown fedora, edges frayed, shaded a gaze that had witnessed what others could never imagine. His outfit was simple but sharp. Clean khakis, polished brown loafers, a crisp shirt under a wool coat. No medals, no rank. Just a cane in one hand and a single envelope in the other. Thin, sealed, and weighty in purpose. "Good morning," he said, handing over an old military ID, pulled from the inner fold of a long-worn wallet. His voice was clear, calm. "I'm here for the remembrance ceremony." The lieutenant at the post, Mason Rusk, 28, smirking, fresh haircut, took the card with 2 fingers, like it was beneath him. He looked at it, laughed. "This thing. Man, it expired before I was born," he said, waving it at the others. "Looks like a cereal box freebie." Elijah stood still, face unchanged. He'd faced worse. Much worse. Rusk kept talking, tapping the ID on the steel booth like it annoyed him. "Seriously? We get enough wannabes strolling up playing hero for attention." Inside, Sergeant Kylie Baines leaned out the booth's window, coffee in hand. "Let me guess," she said, voice thick with sarcasm. "Another war legend with stories and a souvenir from the Reagan years?" The guards laughed. Elijah said nothing. He lifted his hand, steady and deliberate, to retrieve his card. His fingers grazed the edge of the envelope under his arm. No change in expression, no shift in posture. Rusk gave a careless shrug and returned the ID. "Sorry, Pops. No current badge, no entry. Try the museum. Maybe they'll let you salute the exhibits." Elijah gave one slow nod. Then he turned and walked back toward the lot. No complaints, no words. Just a quiet exit. Where there had been chuckles, only silence remained. Private Alio Torres, pressed against the inside wall of the booth, had said nothing the entire time. He hadn't laughed, hadn't smiled, just watched. Under his cap, his eyes followed the old man's back, and something in his gut shifted. He walked away slowly, each step measured, not defeated, just done. "That was something else," Torres mumbled under his breath. Lieutenant Rusk was still grinning, clearly impressed with himself. "Come on, Torres. You're not buying that, right? That ID looked like it went through Gulf War and a rinse cycle." Sergeant Baines let out a snort into her styrofoam cup. He had that wise old warrior vibe going. Probably tells neighborhood kids he used to spar with Bruce Lee. More laughter followed. A few other soldiers nearby caught wind of the joking and drifted over. Corporal Lenny Shaw, smirking, added his piece. "Honestly, thought he was maintenance. Who tries to get on base in khakis and a grandpa sweater?" Another voice piped up. "Maybe he's writing a memoir. How I faked my way into a military ceremony without even trying." And just like that, it snowballed. One joke rolled into the next. The laughter built like a wave. Louder, meaner, easier. Someone mocked Elijah's slow, deliberate walk, leaning into an invisible cane and pretending to squint at the road. Rusk laughed hard at that one, shaking his head like it was the performance of the day. But Torres didn't smile. He was watching something else. Down the path, the old man had reached a bench under a low-hanging tree. He sat, calm, still. He removed his hat, placed it in his lap with care. He never once looked back. There was something about that, about him, that didn't feel off. It felt too real, too intentional, too composed to be fake. Torres had grown up hearing stories. His grandfather, his abuelo, had served in Korea. never shared details unless asked, and even then, his voice would drop, slow down, like it was carrying ghosts. Elijah Monroe had that same quiet gravity, the kind some men carry because no one else ever did, and they had laughed at him. Torres's brow furrowed. "Doesn't feel right," he said under his breath. "You say something?" Rusk asked, carelessly tossing the weathered ID into a plastic bag labeled Invalid Credentials. Torres didn't respond. He just stepped out of the booth and looked again at the old man, still seated, still silent beneath the tree. The sun caught on the smooth wood of Elijah's cane. Etched faintly near the handle was the unmistakable emblem of the Marine Corps. Not a novelty, not fake, the real thing. Torres reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His cousin Jordan worked base-side logistics out of Arlington. He might be able to quietly check the name. No fuss, just a quiet confirmation. Inside the guard booth, the laughter kept rolling, bouncing off the walls like it had nowhere better to go. Outside, where the breeze moved through the branches, Elijah Monroe remained still. No flinch, no shift, but something had changed. Torres could feel it, a weight in the air, like a fuse had been lit. This wasn't finished, not even close. At that same hour, in the mess hall, Deborah Lane stirred a pot of grits near the back stove. The morning buzz had just begun. 2 young soldiers wandered in early for coffee, voices low but eager. "You should have seen him," one said, chuckling. "Dude showed up like he was about to brief the Joint Chiefs." Rusk nearly lost it. Deborah didn't react. She just kept stirring. "ID looked like it was printed during the Civil War," the other said, laughing. "Guy had a cane in this weird envelope like he was holding secret launch codes." Her spoon slowed, just for a moment. "Rusk told him to try the museum," one added. Guy didn't even argue, just turned around and walked off. Still no word from Deborah, but her eyes narrowed, and her stirring stopped altogether. Deborah turned from the stove, her voice low but focused. "What did he look like?" One of the soldiers shrugged. "Old, black, maybe mid-80s, had a brown hat, kinda soft-looking, not a ball cap." Something shifted in her chest. "A brown felt hat?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Yeah," another nodded. "One of those classic ones, like it meant something." Deborah laid the spoon aside, her movements exact. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron. "Was he quiet?" They looked at one another, then back to her. Didn't say much, didn't argue, just turned and walked. Deborah exhaled, gaze drifting. Her voice, when it returned, came from someplace farther away. "I think I saw him once, years back, when this whole base still smelled like fuel and fire, and broken promises." The young soldier stilled. "It was 1982, she said, eyes locked on something long past. "There was a blast at the fuel depot. Smoke everywhere. People running." She paused. "All but one man, thin, older, even then. Walked straight into the chaos like it was nothing. Carried out 3 wounded men on his own. Never spoke. Just disappeared." "You think it's him?" one of them asked. Tone no longer casual. Deborah's lips pressed together. "I never caught his name," she murmured. "But I remember that face. And that hat." The mess hall went silent. Back at the gate, Torres sat alone in the break room. His phone was pressed tightly to his ear. "Jordan, it's me. I need a favor. You still have access to legacy personnel archives?" A beat of quiet on the other end. "I need you to run a name. Discreetly. Elijah Monroe. Probably served before Vietnam. Marines. Maybe higher rank." As he ended the call, Torres turned toward the window. Elijah was still there. Same bench. Same stillness. Unmoving. Unbothered. Like he'd weathered worse storms, and didn't mind waiting for this one to pass. Torres whispered words he'd heard from his father long ago. "Real soldiers don't demand honor. They carry it." Elsewhere, near the comms desk, a young tech overheard part of Deborah's story. Curiosity tugged at him. Quietly, he snapped a quick photo through the mess hall glass. Elijah, seated in profile, hat resting in his lap, eyes forward like a sentry made of memory. He uploaded it to the base's internal board with a short caption. "Anyone recognize this vet?" Turned away at the gate. "Mess hall says he saved lives in '82. The caption was soft. The image was not. Within minutes, the silence began to crack. The Fort Grantham Security Center rarely knew quiet. Radios buzzed, boots crossed tile, guards came and went. But when the call came in, a singular, sharp ring, it sliced through everything. Torres was closest. He glanced at the caller ID. His body tensed. Pentagon. secured channel. He stood straight, spine tight. Private Torres speaking. The voice on the other end was smooth steel, crisp, direct, unmistakably high command. "This is Colonel Renee Langston. I need to speak with the checkpoint lead, now. Put me on speaker." There was no hesitation. Torres lifted a hand, silencing the others in the room. His voice carried, "Lieutenant Rusk, incoming from D.C. They want you on speaker," Torres said calmly. Lieutenant Rusk, fresh from retelling his version of events in the locker room, swaggered in, half smirking. He leaned forward toward the console. "This is Lieutenant Mason Rusk. How can I—" "Put me on speaker." The voice sliced through the air, icy, controlled, sharp enough to still the room. Rusk's fingers hesitated, then fumbled for the button. The line clicked. A chill swept through the space as the voice echoed clear and commanding. "Lieutenant Rusk," the voice began, firm and composed. "This is Colonel Renee Langston, Special Operations Legacy Office." The room froze. "As of this moment, you are to extend full military honors to the man you denied at your checkpoint, Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe." Langston's tone remained precise, each word a reprimand. "You're speaking of a soldier whose service predates your birth. His record includes operations still blacked out across 4 divisions. Missions classified at levels you don't have clearance to read." Rusk's face turned pale. "Ma'am, I didn't realize—" "No," Langston cut in. "You didn't. You saw a weathered man with an old ID and turned it into a punchline." She didn't stop. "That man led Operation Falcon Wing in '72. He orchestrated the rescue of 27 POWs from North Vietnam. No casualties. His status under Directive 117B grants him perpetual clearance. Indefinitely." The silence was suffocating. Sergeant Baines stammered. "Wait, Elijah Monroe? That Monroe?" "Yes," Langston confirmed flatly. "And he was mocked at your gate." Just then, headlights appeared through the booth window. A black military vehicle rolled to a halt. 3 officers stepped out in formal dress, their movements crisp. At the front of the group stood a tall, broad man in full uniform. His presence was immediate. Colonel Isaac Greer. His voice didn't rise, but it held weight. "Where is Sergeant Major Monroe?" Rusk, throat dry, lifted a trembling finger toward the bench beneath the tree. Colonel Greer nodded once. "Stand down. Prepare for honors protocol." Without delay, he moved toward the old man. Inside the booth, no one moved. Rusk's hands twitched, his bravado gone. Torres broke the silence. Quiet, almost to himself. "Didn't I say?" Outside, Elijah Monroe stood. Greer raised a salute, deliberate and precise. Elijah answered with quiet certainty, a motion he'd made countless times before. But this one landed different. This time, he was seen. Whispers began to ripple across the base. By the time Colonel Greer returned with Elijah walking beside him, those whispers had evolved into commands. Urgent voices buzzed through radios and halls. Full honors. Memorial protocol. Prepare the route. From barracks to offices, word spread like a signal flare. The air changed. The entire base responded. Uniforms were straightened, ribbons secured, brass buttons polished in a rush. An honor guard lined the path stretching from the front gate to the ceremonial square. And there, at the center of it all, walked Elijah Monroe, slowly, proudly. His cane now rested under one arm. His hat still shielded his gaze. The envelope remained, sealed, untouched. Beside him, Colonel Greer matched his pace. 2 other officers flanked them. Silent. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The sound of boots snapping to attention said everything. And as they neared the gate, Lieutenant Rusk was waiting, at full attention. Eyes forward. Every word he had said now weighing more than his rank. Eyes ahead, jaw tight. Lieutenant Rusk stood rigid at the gate. Beside him, Sergeant Baines, face pale, unreadable. Neither dared breathe, let alone speak. Elijah walked past them without pause. But Colonel Greer didn't. He stopped, turned slightly, his voice calm but pointed. "For your awareness," he said to the group, "that ID you dismissed? It carries a silent beacon. A pause. It pings once a year. On Veterans Day. That's how we know he's still with us." Rusk blinked, stunned. "You track him?" Greer's tone cooled. "We honor him. Quietly, as he's always preferred. Sergeant Major Monroe never wanted parades. Just a reminder that those who didn't return are never forgotten." He turned and resumed walking. Torres stood in the booth, heart racing. eyes following the formation as it advanced down the road, now lined with soldiers at full salute. The sunlight gleamed off pressed metals and ceremonial coats, and the quiet, the heavy, resounding quiet, pressed into every corner of the base. By the time Elijah reached the courtyard at the center of Fort Grantham, the crowd had doubled. Officers, privates, cooks, clerks, and mechanics, all standing. No murmurs, no excuses, just silence and salutes. Colonel Greer gestured toward the stone memorial, a black reflective wall etched with names time had nearly erased. Elijah stepped forward, alone. From his jacket he drew the envelope, the one no one had touched but him. He knelt, not out of weakness, not from age, from reverence. Across the crowd, heads bowed, his hand pressed to the wall, finding names worn by decades, ignored by history, but never forgotten by him. 18 soldiers, their names spoken only in his memories, names he had carried longer than anyone else alive. He didn't speak, he didn't shed tears, but the silence wrapped around him like a sacred cloth. When he finally rose, turning slowly to face the crowd, a single voice broke the stillness. "Sergeant Major, on deck!" In perfect synchrony, hundreds of boots struck the ground. Salutes rose, not by protocol, not by command, by respect. Long, overdue. Elijah Monroe stood in the center of the courtyard, facing the polished stone, the wind barely tugging at the brim of his hat. He reached out, fingertips gently skimming over the engraved names, his touch slow, deliberate, like a man reading the past through memory. Each name was a life, each letter, a face. These were his men. Some called him Sergeant, others just said Monroe, but every one of them had followed him into fire, and everyone had trusted him to bring them home. Elijah broke the hush. "I didn't come for recognition," he said, voice quiet but clear. "I came to leave these." He bent once more and placed the envelope carefully at the base of the wall. "I've written every year," he said, not turning. "One for each of them. I told their families the truth, who they were, what they gave, what they left behind." The courtyard remained motionless. "I never mailed them," he added, more to the stone than the crowd. "Didn't think anyone would care." Colonel Greer stepped forward, voice steady but full. "They did, Sergeant Major." Elijah looked over his shoulder, startled, just slightly, and something in his eyes began to soften. Greer nodded. "We've been retrieving those letters for years." The air shifted. "The addresses and names on those envelopes?" He paused. "They weren't symbolic. We hand-delivered each one." A murmur ran through the gathered ranks. Elijah blinked, slow, deliberate. For the first time all day, his composure cracked. "You delivered them?" "Yes, sir, every November. Some families keep every word. Some read them aloud at dinner. A few even framed them." A stillness thicker than silence settled over the courtyard. Elijah shut his eyes. When he opened them, they shimmered. Not from sorrow, from finally being seen. At the back, Lieutenant Rusk remained stiff. His eyes didn't move. They stayed locked on Elijah. When their gazes met, Rusk stepped forward slightly. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Elijah held his look, then gave a small, solemn nod. "You saw a man, but not what he carried." Rusk's throat tightened. "I see it now." The formation slowly parted, clearing a path. Elijah needed no escort. He walked with purpose. As he passed, recruits and officers stood straighter, not out of habit, but from realization. The wall behind him bore the fallen, but among those names, one man remained standing. That afternoon, Fort Grantham's commander summoned a base-wide assembly. Over 200 soldiers filled the main hall, many still fresh from training. The usual hum of banter was gone. Expressionless faces waited in stillness. Colonel Greer stepped up to the podium. "Most days, you study history," he said. "Today, you stood in front of it." He stepped aside. Elijah Monroe approached, hat in hand, slow, steady. The room leaned in, not to hear louder, but to hear clearer. He looked across the room at those young faces, some confused, some reflective, all listening. "I'm not a hero," he began. "I'm just a man who kept his word." He paused, glancing toward the back, toward Rusk. "They teach you that honor is in stripes or decorations," he continued. "But true honor lives in the moments no one's watching. It's how you treat someone who doesn't fit the picture in your head." He stepped back. What followed wasn't loud, it was reverent. Later, Rusk approached him, hesitant, honest. "Sergeant Major, I failed you." Elijah didn't flinch. "You failed yourself." Then softer. "But now you choose. Lead differently, or keep pretending the mirror's lying. Rusk straightened. I'll do better, sir. Elijah nodded. He accepted no apology. Just truth. That evening, under dimming sky, a bronze plaque was mounted at the main gate. The Elijah Monroe Gate, for the quiet courage we almost missed. Beneath it, smaller text read, Honor lives on, even when the paperwork doesn't. Fort Grantham hadn't just corrected a mistake, it had learned something it couldn't unlearn. Not because of Elijah's past, but because of what he stood for. 1 year later, as morning mist hugged the hills of Briar Ridge, a black SUV rumbled up a gravel path. No one rang the bell. They didn't have to. Elijah Monroe already stood on the porch, hat in hand, waiting as he always did each Veterans Day. A young soldier stepped out, saluting. Sergeant Major, he said. Permission to accompany you? Elijah gave a faint nod. Permission granted. And so the tradition endured. Every year, a car would arrive. Every year Elijah returned, not for speeches or salutes, but to kneel before the names, to whisper, to leave one more envelope. He never asked for attention. The base gave it anyway. An honor corridor formed each time, not from duty, but from something deeper, gratitude. When he passed quietly at 89, there was no headline, just a final letter on his desk, sealed tight, for the ones I couldn't bring back. Inside, one last message. Honor doesn't fade. It waits to be remembered. And justice, though late, is never absent. Do what's right, especially when no one's looking. At Fort Grantham, the Elijah Monroe Gate still stands, and every new recruit hears the story. Not of a man who asked for recognition, but of one who carried it in silence. Because some leave medals behind. Others leave something more. A legacy etched in reverence. And a name that echoes far beyond stone.